The mail-order bride brought two virgin sisters. The Apache warrior chose all three. The noon train hissed against the platform as if relieved to stop running, its metal breath drifting across the empty station on the edge of New Mexico territory. And when the doors finally clattered open, three young women stepped out. Not with the hopeful excitement most mail-order brides carried, but with the quiet, frightened caution of people who had run farther than their legs were meant to carry. First came the eldest, Alara, her shoulders squared as if she could shield the two behind her. Then Miriam, the soft-spoken middle sister clutching a small satchel to her chest. And lastly, the youngest, Ruth, barely 18, her eyes darting across the silent dirt road that stretched out like a question with no good answer. They stood close together, forming a tight circle of instinctive protection, and though their dresses were clean, the edges were frayed, and the bruising on Ruth's wrist had not yet faded. No one else stepped onto the platform, no rancher waiting with flowers or nervous hope, just three sisters stepping into a world where they did not know if they had outrun the men who once claimed them. A hot wind stirred dust across the tracks as they waited, their breaths measured, the ticket officer already retreating inside his booth, uninterested in travelers who brought too much trouble with them. And that was when the silence split with the soft crunch of footsteps. Measured, deliberate, not the hurried stride of pursuit, but the grounded walk of a man who owned his pace. The sisters tensed as an Apache warrior approached from the far side of the station, his long shadow cutting across the boards before his body did. His dark hair tied back, chest marked with paint, eyes quiet but too sharp to ignore. Alara instinctively stepped in front of her sisters, chin lifted even as her hands trembled, but the warrior didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stopped a few feet away, studying them with a depth that felt more like concern than threat, the kind of look a man gives when he sees someone who has been chased too long. "You are waiting for someone," he said in accented English, his tone low and steady, and Alara swallowed before answering, We were supposed to be met here," though the way her voice broke made the lie obvious to both of them. The warrior glanced at the tracks, then at the road, then at their worn shoes and the fear they tried to swallow. And something in his expression shifted, not pity, not curiosity, but a quiet understanding forged from his own share of running from danger. Ruth's knees buckled for a moment, and he stepped forward just enough to offer his canteen, placing it gently near her hands without touching her, waiting until she decided to take it. And when she finally did, her trembling eased just a breath. Alara watched him warily, but when he nodded once, slow and respectful, as if promising nothing except that he meant no harm, something inside her cracked, the smallest thread of belief that maybe the world had not turned its back on them completely. Behind them, the train pulled away, leaving only silence, heat, and the unsettling truth that whatever happened next, these three sisters were no longer alone. The warrior's name, they learned slowly and without asking, was Kael. And after a long moment of silence between them, he looked past the sisters toward the open stretch of dirt leading away from the station, his gaze sharpening the way a hunter's does when a truth reveals itself without anyone speaking it. The sisters followed his eyes and saw nothing but shimmering heat, yet Kael stepped off the platform, knelt in the dust, and touched two shallow grooves in the earth with the tips of his fingers, the way one reads a sentence carved by danger rather than ink. Alara's breath hitched, because even from where she stood she could see it now too. Fresh wagon tracks, the kind that didn't belong to travelers or ranch families, but to men who had ridden hard and without mercy, the kind who did not give up what they believed they owned. Kael rose slowly, dusting his palms against his leggings, his face shifting into a stillness so heavy it felt like the air had thickened around them, and when he stepped back toward the platform, he spoke softly, as if speaking louder might summon the riders themselves. "They are not far." Miriam's fingers tightened around her satchel until her knuckles whitened, tears welling but refusing to fall, while Ruth pressed close to Alara's back, her trembling more visible now that the truth could no longer be hidden. Alara tried to gather her sisters with her arms as if she could fold them into safety, but fear had already slipped through their clothes and settled deep, the kind that comes from knowing that the men who hunted them did not pursue out of love. They pursued out of possession, angered by the fact that three women they thought they controlled had dared to run. "We paid for tickets," Alara whispered, her voice breaking as if the ink on those paper stubs should have bought something more than another day of running. And Kael looked at her with a steadiness that made her words fall quiet, his presence somehow grounding even as danger crept closer. "You came to marry," he said, not guessing, but stating it as though he could read the desperation in their posture, and Alara nodded, unable to speak the rest. That the man who was supposed to meet her had died 2 months earlier, leaving their letters unanswered and their only chance at survival. Kael looked again toward the road, jaw tightening, and he moved his hand subtly in a gesture that meant follow, though not out of command but of necessity. "If you stay here, they will find you before the sun moves," he warned. And though no sister wanted to trust a stranger, something in his voice was different from every man they had ever known. There was no hunger in it, no claim, no ownership, only a quiet urgency wrapped in honor. The three of them stepped off the platform, boots crunching in the dust, and Kael guided them toward the shallow shade behind the station where the land dipped slightly, giving them a place to hide their silhouettes. A hawk circled above, its cry slicing through the heavy air, and Kael watched it before saying, "They ride with anger. They will not stop until they see your faces again." And for the first time since fleeing, Alara no longer felt like they were running alone, because someone else, someone stronger, someone unafraid, had seen the danger chasing them, and had silently decided to stand in its way. Kael led them only far enough to break the line of sight from the road, stopping near a cluster of mesquite trees whose twisted branches made a natural screen against the sun. And there he finally turned to face the sisters fully, his posture calm yet alert, as if he carried a map of danger inside his ribs and could feel the rhythm of every approaching threat. Alara tried to steady her breathing, one arm wrapped protectively around Ruth while Miriam clutched the worn satchel that held the only belongings they had left: 3 dresses, a folded letter from a dead groom, and coins not even enough to buy a loaf of bread. Kael's eyes moved from one sister to the next, not lingering, not consuming, simply observing with the kind of quiet comprehension that made it feel as if he saw more than their faces, as if he could sense the months of running, the bruises, the whispered promises they made to each other on cold nights when hope felt thin as thread. "You fear men with iron hearts," Kael said softly, and though his accent was shaped by another world, his words struck so precisely that Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if someone had pulled truth straight from her chest. Alara swallowed, forcing herself to speak though her voice trembled like a fence in the wind. "They think we belong to them. We never did." And Kael nodded once, not questioning, not prying, simply accepting their truth as they gave it, which somehow made it easier to breathe. He reached into the small satchel at his side and pulled out a folded piece of buckskin, spreading it on the ground. It was a crude but clear map of the territory, marked with small symbols, and he tapped a place slightly west, saying, "My people's camp is here, safe, watched. No man will take you from there unless you choose to leave." And the way he spoke the word choose felt like a door quietly opening in the center of Alara's chest. Miriam's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face, because no man had ever offered them a choice without expecting something in return. But Kael simply sat back on his heels and waited, giving them space to decide their own fate. "Why would you help us?" Miriam whispered, not out of accusation, but with the fragile disbelief of someone who has never been protected without cost. And Kael's eyes softened, a flicker of something human and old crossing his expression as he answered, "Once, someone hid my sister from men like the ones who follow you. I repaid debts that saved my blood." The world seemed to still around them, the wind dropping, the heat lowering its voice as if honoring the weight of what he had shared. And Ruth, who had been silent until now, stepped closer to him, not touching, just near enough that he could see the terror and hope tangled in her small frame. And she whispered, "Will they find us before we reach your people?" Kael did not lie, did not paint comfort where danger stood. He glanced toward the distant road once more, then back at the 3 sisters, his voice steady and low as thunder contained inside a mountain. "If they track well, yes. If we move fast and quiet, no. But I will not let them take you while I still breathe." And though the promise was simple, without bravado or flourish, it settled into the sisters' bones with the weight of truth. Finally, after all the miles of fear, someone had looked straight into their terror and not flinched. Someone had seen their brokenness and answered with honor instead of hunger. Someone who didn't know them at all had chosen to stand between them and the men who wanted to drag them back into darkness. They traveled under the punishing heat of late afternoon, Kael guiding them along narrow paths that cut between sandstone ridges and dry creek beds, routes chosen not for speed but for the way they erased tracks, paths only someone raised by desert and wind would know. The sisters followed closely, their skirts catching on thorn brush, their breaths growing shallow with exhaustion they didn't dare voice, yet none of them slowed. Not even Ruth, who stumbled more than once but straightened each time before Kael could reach her. He noticed, of course, the silent pain etched into her steps, but he said nothing until they reached a shallow wash where a few stubborn cottonwoods cast thin shadows across the ground, and there he stopped, lifting a hand for silence. The sisters froze, every muscle tensed, until he pointed to the faintest mark in the mud. One single horseshoe print angled wrong, not theirs, not fresh, but not old either, and the sight of it tightened the world around them. "We rest only until the sun drops," Kael said, his voice low so it wouldn't travel, and he motioned for them to settle near the cluster of trees while he gathered fallen branches, nothing thick enough to make smoke, only thin strips of deadwood that would burn fast and clean. Alara frowned, confused. Building a fire was the last thing she expected, but Kael knelt in the dirt and struck flint until a tiny flame sparked, growing into a narrow ribbon of controlled light. He didn't sit near it, didn't make himself comfortable, didn't treat it like a campfire meant for warmth or companionship. Instead, he placed it between the sisters and the darkening east, the direction from which danger would come, and with a piece of flat stone he shaped the flame in a way that meant it would be seen only from that angle. Miriam watched him, realization dawning slowly, and finally she whispered, "It's a warning, not a camp." And Kael nodded, confirming without words that the fire was not lit to comfort them, but to mark the moment he had drawn a line. Any man following their trail would see the glow, think the sisters were exposed, approach carelessly, and walk straight into the ambush Kael intended. He moved silently through the shadows as the first stars pricked the sky, positioning stones, adjusting the angle of the flame, reading the wind as if it whispered secrets only he understood. Alara sat with her sisters huddled close, her heartbeat still skittering with fear. But watching Kael work eased something inside her. Not because he looked strong, though he did, nor because he looked capable, though he was, but because he looked disciplined, controlled, a man moved by purpose rather than impulse. When he finally returned to the shaded cluster where they waited, he didn't take a seat or reach for food or ask questions. He simply stood with his back to them, scanning the ridge lines, body still as stone except for the slow rise and fall of his breath. Ruth whispered, barely audible, "He doesn't even look at us." Surprise softening her tone, and Miriam leaned closer to her, murmuring, "That's why we can trust him." The fire crackled softly, contained and intentional, and for the first time since they'd stepped off the train, the sisters felt something that didn't quite resemble safety but moved in that direction. Because this man, this stranger bound by honor, had lit a fire not to claim them, but to protect them, not to warm them, but to warn the men who hunted them that the ground ahead would not be theirs. As the sun dipped fully behind the jagged ridge, the desert cooled with startling speed, replacing the heavy afternoon heat with a crisp stillness that made every sound feel sharper, and Kael motioned for the sisters to huddle inside the shallow hollow beneath the cottonwoods while he kept his place outside, a silent sentinel outlined by faint starlight. The small fire he had built had burned down to controlled embers, just bright enough to lure eyes but not enough to reveal their shelter. And for a long while the only sound was the rhythmic rise and fall of the desert wind brushing against the brush. Miriam sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes tracking Kael's silhouette, and it wasn't until Alara rested a hand gently on her shoulder that she whispered, "We can't keep running forever," her voice cracking with the weight of months they had never been able to speak aloud. Alara inhaled deeply, then nodded, turning to look at her sisters, finally understanding that if there was ever a moment to share the truth, raw and unhidden, it was here, under the watch of a man who owed them nothing, yet protected them with a fierceness that made her feel less alone. So she began, hesitant at first, then with a painful steadiness. "Our stepfather sold us," she said, the words trembling into the darkness like bruised birds, and Miriam pressed her face into her hands while Ruth's breath shuddered, her fingers digging into the hem of Alara's dress. "Alara was meant for marriage," Miriam whispered through tears, "and we were just part of the bargain." The hollow filled with a heavy silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that comes when truth has finally torn itself free. Kael shifted then, not turning toward them, not interrupting, but lowering himself into a crouch just close enough for them to know he was listening. Ruth wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, her voice cracking as she added, "When the man who bought us died, his sons claimed they owned us now. They said we were property, same as a horse or a fence line." And her words carried the tremble of someone still waiting for the world to prove her wrong. Alara swallowed hard before continuing, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of Kael's shoulders. "We stole their money, bought train tickets, and prayed we'd make it to someone who would take us in before they caught us." But as soon as the confession left her mouth, guilt crashed over her and she buried her face in her hands, whispering, "We didn't have any other choice." Kael remained still for a long breath, the night air holding its quiet around him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only they could hear it. "You took back what they stole first," he said, not as comfort, not as flattery, but as a simple truth spoken by a man who had lived enough injustice to know its shape in the dark. He turned his head slightly then, just enough that they could see the sharp line of his jaw, the fire-lit glint in his eyes, and he added, "There is no shame in surviving. There is only shame in those who hunted you." The sisters stared at him, the weight of his words settling deep. And in that moment the desert felt a little less cruel, the night a little less large, because Kael had not recoiled from their story, nor judged them, nor turned away. He had listened, believed, and given their suffering a dignity the world had long denied. The night had settled deep when Kael stiffened, his head tilting slightly the way an animal listens to something long before humans can hear it, and the sisters froze as though their fear itself had sensed what he had. Some distant tremor in the stillness, a vibration too soft to be sound yet heavy enough to ripple through the ground beneath them. Kael rose without a word, every movement careful, controlled, and he stepped past the cottonwoods to the lip of the wash, crouching low as he pressed his palm to the cool earth. A breath later he whispered, "Horses," and the single word turned the sisters' blood to ice. Miriam clutched Ruth's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened, while Alara crawled closer to Kael, her voice barely a breath. "How many?" Kael didn't look back, his eyes fixed on the darkness stretching eastward, but the answer came in the tightening of his jaw before he spoke. 3. Maybe 4. They ride fast." Alara's stomach twisted. 3 or 4 meant the sons, maybe even the hired hand who beat Ruth for crying on the night they escaped, and fear closed around her like a fist. But Kael placed a steadying hand on the ground, signaling her to stay low. Above them, the sky had gone ink dark, the stars sharp as needles, and the faint glow of the decoy fire pulsed in the distance, right where Kael had built it to draw attention away from their hiding place. "They think you camped there," Kael murmured, more to himself than to them, and he shifted 10 paces to the right, slipping into the shadows between the mesquites like a blade disappearing into a sheath. The sisters waited, breaths shallow, the air thick with the metallic taste of fear, until the first hint of approaching danger arrived. Not sound, not yet, but a dim vibration, a subtle trembling in the branches above them. Then the hoofbeats came, slow at first, cautious, the way men ride when they sense prey close enough that patience matters more than force. Ruth covered her mouth to keep from gasping, her eyes wide enough to reflect the faint ember glow from the decoy clearing, and Alara gathered both her sisters close, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood, promises she didn't fully believe but needed to say. Kael was now a shadow among shadows, positioned between the riders and the sisters, his outline barely visible but unmistakably ready. The riders reached the decoy fire, their horses snorting softly as they circled, and one man dismounted, his voice sharp and ugly as he cursed, kicking apart the stones Kael had placed. "I told you they couldn't have gotten far," another snapped, his tone dripping with the cruel certainty of someone who feels entitled to possession. Their lantern swung in the darkness, throwing jagged light across the sand. And for a moment, Alara feared it might catch the faint glint of Kael's eyes, but he remained impossibly still, blending into the night with inhuman patience. "Tracks end here," the older brother muttered, kneeling near the fire, and Ruth's breath hitched as she recognized his voice, the voice that haunted every mile they had run. Kael shifted subtly, a movement so small the sisters barely noticed, but it marked a decision settling into his bones, a vow crystallizing in the cool desert air. The men were close, too close, but they were also misled, circling the false fire like wolves confused by a scent trail gone wrong. "We move west at first light," the eldest said, slamming his boot into the dust, frustrated but not deterred. Kael waited, until the horses turned, until the lantern swung away, until the hoofbeats faded into the far dark. And only then did he return to the hollow, his breathing steady as stone, his voice low as he said, "They will come again, but now we know their pace." And though the fear remained heavy in their chests, the sisters felt something new beneath it, a rising thread of strength braided with the quiet conviction that they were no longer being hunted alone. Dawn broke with a pale, washed-out light that made the desert look older than the night before, the sky stretching wide and thin like a promise the world wasn't sure it could keep. And Kael, who had not slept for more than a handful of breaths, urged the sisters forward before the sun's first true heat could paint their shadows long across the sand. They moved quietly, following the narrow spine of a dry arroyo where their footprints would blur into the natural ridges. But before they'd gone half a mile, Kael stopped so abruptly that Alara nearly collided with him. He lifted a hand, signaling stillness, and his eyes sharpened toward a distant ridge where four dark shapes on horseback had just crested the horizon, their silhouettes unmistakable even at a distance. Fear surged through Miriam's chest, and Ruth instinctively reached for Alara, but Kael stepped in front of them, planting himself in the open with the calmness of a man who had chosen his ground long before sunrise. "They found the map's edge faster than I thought," he said under his breath, scanning the terrain, calculating angles, distances, the slope of the sand, the direction of the wind, his mind working with the silent ferocity of someone who had survived too many battles to ever underestimate desperation. The riders urged their horses down the slope, kicking up dust clouds that rose like warnings in the early light, and Alara felt her strength falter, her legs trembling beneath her. But Kael turned his head just enough to meet her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a steadiness that birthed something sharp and defiant in her chest. "You three, behind the rocks," he ordered softly, not harshly, not possessively, but with a tone edged by a seriousness that left no room for fear to argue. They obeyed, crouching behind a cluster of boulders shaped by wind and time, the stone cool beneath their hands as they pressed themselves into its shadow. Miriam whispered, "Kael can't face all of them alone." But Ruth shook her head fiercely, whispering back, "He won't be alone. We're here," though she didn't know what help they could truly offer. Kael stepped out into the open, his figure framed by the rising sun, every line of him cut sharp with resolve. And as the riders closed the distance, the eldest brother, broad, cruel around the mouth, and certain of his own dominance, pulled his horse to a halt, glaring down at Kael with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. "Step aside," he demanded. "This ain't your concern." But Kael didn't move, his voice steady as stone when he replied, "It became mine the moment you chased what you had no right to claim." The men barked ugly laughter, mocking the warrior standing alone in their path, but Kael didn't flinch. He simply lowered his weight, grounding himself, hand near the knife at his belt, not because he wanted violence, but because he understood the language of men whose hearts had been hardened by greed. The eldest brother sneered, leaning forward in his saddle. "Those girls belong to us." And before Alara could stop herself, she rose halfway from behind the rocks, her voice cracking with fury as she shouted, We belong to no one. Kael didn't turn toward her, didn't risk giving away her position, but something in his stance shifted, a subtle tightening of muscle that told her he had taken her words as fuel. You will not touch them, he said, quieter this time, almost gentle, but with a weight beneath it that made even the horses shift nervously. The eldest brother spat into the dust, muttering, Fine then, we'll go through you. And he kicked his horse forward, drawing the pistol from his hip. But Kael stepped forward too, no fear in his face, no hesitation in his bones. Just the unshakable choice of a man who had decided that if these sisters were to be dragged back into darkness, it would not happen while he still drew breath. And in that instant the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether honor or brutality would claim the next heartbeat. The moment the eldest brother kicked his horse forward, time seemed to split. Kael moving with a speed that didn't feel human, the sisters gasping behind the rocks, the sun catching on the metal of the drawn pistol like a cruel omen. But before the riders could close the gap, Kael angled sharply to the side, forcing the lead horse to swerve, its hooves skidding in the loose sand as the rider cursed and yanked at the reins. The sudden shift threw the formation into chaos, one horse rearing, another stumbling back, and in that sliver of confusion, Kael stepped in close, grabbed the man's wrist, and slammed it against the saddle horn with such precision that the gun fell uselessly to the ground. The man roared, reaching for Kael's throat, but Kael ducked beneath his arm, using the horse's movement to pivot himself behind its flank, always keeping his body between the riders and the sisters. Alara covered her mouth to keep from crying out, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shake loose from her ribs, while Miriam whispered frantic prayers that tangled with her breath, and Ruth, trembling but fierce, pressed her hand against the rock wall, ready to spring out if Kael fell. Though she had no weapon, no plan, only the raw instinct to protect the man who had stood for them when the world hadn't. The second rider drew his rifle, leveling it clumsily in Kael's direction, but Kael saw the movement before the man's finger touched the trigger. He dropped to one knee, scooped a fistful of dry sand and flung it upward with a sharp flick that sent grit exploding into the rider's eyes. The man cursed, clawing at his face as the horse twisted beneath him, nearly unseating him. Kael, Ruth cried before she could stop herself, terror clawing its way up her throat, and Kael's head snapped just enough in her direction to tell her he'd heard. But he didn't waste a breath responding, returning instantly to the fight as the eldest brother dismounted in a rage, swinging a hunting knife with the brute strength of a man who relied on size instead of skill. Kael stepped back, letting the man's wild momentum cut empty air, then struck with a clean, controlled blow to the ribs that sent the older brother stumbling. Breathless, sweating, furious, the man lunged again, and this time his blade grazed Kael's arm, a thin line of blood blossoming just below the shoulder. Alara gasped loud enough that Kael's eyes flicked toward her for the briefest instant, and that moment of distraction cost him. The third rider, who'd circled around unseen, charged with his horse, aiming to trample Kael outright. The sisters screamed, but Kael dropped flat, rolling beneath the horse's belly with terrifying precision, grabbing the stirrup as it thundered over him and yanking so hard the rider lost balance and crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. The dust hung thick now, the heat rising from the earth in waves, the men groaning or staggering. But Kael, bleeding, breath heaving, planting himself again in front of the sisters, his body angled just enough to shield them completely. And that was when something broke open inside the sisters. Not fear, but resolve, fierce and absolute, because they could no longer just hide behind him while he stood alone. Alara rose first, stepping out from behind the rocks and shouting, "Enough! This ends today." Her voice cracking but strong, and Miriam followed, clutching a fist-sized stone with trembling hands, and Ruth moved to Kael's wounded side, steadying him, whispering, "You don't stand here alone. Not anymore." And the sight of all three sisters stepping into the open, refusing to cower, refusing to run, refusing to let the man who had protected them bleed alone, struck the riders harder than any blow Kael had thrown. Because for the first time, they saw that the sisters they'd once treated as property had chosen their defender with their whole hearts, and in doing so, had stripped the riders of the power they once wielded like a weapon.
For a heartbeat, everything stood still. the dust hanging suspended in the warming air, the wounded riders panting in ragged disbelief, the sisters standing shoulder to shoulder beside the man who'd bled for them, and Kael, despite the cut on his arm and the bruises forming across his ribs, straightened with a calm that looked almost unreal against the chaos around him. The eldest brother's face twisted with fury as he pushed himself to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his voice breaking into a snarl as he spat. "You think he can protect you? You think any of this changes who owns you?" The words cracked through the desert like a whip, but they no longer hit their mark, because the sisters didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't let the old fear take hold again. Instead, Elara stepped forward, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall, and said in a voice stronger than any she'd ever known, "No man owns us. Not then. Not now. Not ever." Miriam moved to her side, lifting the stone she'd armed herself with, and Ruth stood closest to Kael, pressing her palm silently to his bleeding arm, as if anchoring him, her voice trembling but steady when she whispered, "We choose who we stand with, and we choose him." The declaration struck something deep inside Kael, something old and buried beneath years of quiet solitude, and for the first time since dawn broke, he turned his head enough to look at all three of them. Really look, seeing not fear, but fire, not broken girls, but women who had clawed their way toward freedom and were now refusing to surrender it. The riders hesitated, thrown off balance by this unexpected defiance, and Kael seized the moment, stepping forward with a command in his voice that held the weight of mountains. "Ride back home. Tell your people the sisters you hunted found warriors who stand with them. If you come again, you meet more than just me." The second brother scoffed, but the sound wavered, because he could see the shift as clearly as Kael did. They weren't facing one exhausted man anymore. They were facing something larger, something unshakable, a unity forged by terror and choice, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or beaten out of anyone. The eldest brother reached for his discarded gun, but before his fingers grazed metal, Elara planted her heel on it, pinning it firmly to the ground, her glare daring him to try again. Miriam raised the stone, hands trembling but determined, and Ruth stepped in front of both sisters, as if she could somehow shield them from the danger they refused to back away from. Kael's voice dropped, low and even, the kind of voice that leaves no room for argument. "Leave. Now." And something in his tone, something calm, deadly, certain, finally broke through the rider's bravado. The youngest of them swung onto his horse first, muttering under his breath, and the others followed, though the eldest glared long and hard at Kael before growling, "This ain't over." But even he couldn't hide the flicker of fear in his eyes. They rode off in a thunder of hooves, kicking up dust that shimmered like broken gold in the rising sun. And when the sound finally faded into nothing, Elara let out a sob that collapsed into a shaky laugh. Miriam dropped the stone and covered her face with her hands, and Ruth gently guided Kael down to sit against a rock, her voice soft with a tenderness that pierced straight through the morning air. "You didn't have to fight for us, but you did," she whispered, and Kael, breathing hard, eyes softening as he looked at all three of them, finally allowed himself the truth he'd been holding back since the train station. "I didn't fight for you," he murmured. "I fought with you." And in the stillness that followed, the sisters understood something they had never dared to imagine. Somewhere between the running and the fear and the desert light, they had stopped being three girls alone in the world and started becoming a family built not by blood, but by choice. They reached Kael's people by late afternoon, the sun warm but no longer cruel, the land softening from harsh desert into a patchwork of cottonwoods, shallow river bends, and earth darkened by years of careful tending. The The camp appeared slowly, like something the land revealed only to those it trusted. A cluster of hide-wrapped lodges arranged in a wide circle, smoke rising in clean, thin spirals, children running near the riverbank while elders watched with calm, knowing eyes. As soon as Kael stepped into the clearing, 3 elders rose from where they sat, their lined faces shifting from worry to relief at the sight of him, though their eyes narrowed when they took in the blood on his arm and the 3 women quietly following behind. Elara, Miriam, and Ruth instinctively drew closer together, but Kael gestured gently, a silent promise that they were safe here. And when he spoke in his native tongue to the elders, his voice low and respectful, the tension around them eased like a rope slowly being untied. One of the women, silver-haired and keen-eyed, stepped forward and placed her hand over Kael's wound, murmuring something that made him bow his head slightly, and without hesitation she motioned for the sisters to follow her to the shade of a nearby lodge. The interior smelled of sage and cool earth, and while Kael's wound was dressed outside, the sisters were given water, soft bread, and a chance to breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. Miriam's hands shook as she drank. Elara wiped tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back, and Ruth sat with her fingers tangled in the edge of a woven blanket, her eyes drifting often to the doorway where Kael's shadow moved whenever he spoke with the elders. When he finally stepped inside the lodge, the late light caught his face, softening the planes of it, and he knelt beside them with a quietness that felt like reverence. "You are safe now," he said, and the simplicity of it broke something deep inside Elara, because it was the first time in years anyone had said such words without lying. Miriam let out a breath that shuddered like something leaving her forever, while Ruth leaned forward, pressing her forehead against Kael's uninjured arm, as if anchoring herself to the only solid thing the world had offered her. Kael didn't move away. He simply rested his hand lightly atop her hair, a gesture so gentle it made Miriam cry again. And when Ruth finally lifted her face, blotched but glowing, she whispered, "What happens now?" Kael studied them for a long moment, the kind of silence that weighs truth before speaking it, then replied, "Now you choose." His voice steady, warm, a promise wrapped in freedom. "You may stay here, among my people, where no man will lay claim on you again. Or you may rest until you decide another path. No one will chase you. No one will decide for you." The sisters exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations shared only by people who have survived hell together, and Elara reached for Kael's hand, her voice soft but sure when she said, "We choose to stay, with those who fought for us, and with the man who saw us as more than what we ran from." Kael exhaled, a slow, steady breath, as if he'd been holding the world still until their answer came. And outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like quiet blessing. The 3 sisters leaned into Kael's presence, not as possessions, not as debtors, not as frightened girls, but as a family born from the desert's harsh mercy, and as the sun set beyond the river, painting the edge of the territory gold, they understood that peace wasn't the absence of danger. It was the first moment you believed you no longer had to run. Some people run their whole lives without ever finding a place that chooses them back. But 3 sisters found it in the quiet strength of one Apache warrior, and in the peace that finally stopped their feet from fleeing. Out here, family isn't blood. It's who stands with you when your past tries to drag you home.